I am Brandon Whitaker, 38 years old, living in Raleigh, North Carolina, married to my wife Megan Whitaker, 35 for 11 years. And if I am being honest, the collapse of our marriage did not come with shouting or broken plates or some dramatic confession under dim kitchen lights, but instead with a slow, steady erosion that felt almost polite at first, like water wearing down stone while you were too distracted to notice the shape changing. In the beginning, Megan used to laugh easily. She used to lean into me on the couch. She used to text me in the middle of the day just to say she missed me. But somewhere along the way, those small gestures were replaced with eye rolls, with sighs that carried entire paragraphs of unspoken contempt, with comments framed as jokes that somehow always landed at my expense. She started talking about rediscovering herself, about growth, about how she had spent too many years being defined by other people's expectations. And on the surface, that sounded healthy, supportive even, and I told myself that a good husband should encourage that kind of self-exploration. But gradually I realized that in every story she told about her awakening, there was an unspoken villain, and it was always me. It happened in subtle rewrites of our shared history, where she would describe the early years of our marriage as if she had been confined rather than loved, as if my stability had been a cage instead of a foundation, and she began using language that made me sound like an anchor dragging her down while she was trying to become something brighter and lighter. When friends came over, she would make little remarks about how she used to be spontaneous before she settled down, how she once had dreams of traveling the world alone, and she would laugh in a way that invited everyone else to laugh too. And I would sit there smiling stiffly, pretending I did not feel myself shrinking in my own living room. The sarcasm became her default tone with me, as if sincerity was something she had outgrown, and any attempt I made to reconnect was treated like a relic from a less enlightened version of her life. That night was not special in any obvious way. It was a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary evening that should have been forgettable. I had finished cleaning up after dinner, and she was scrolling through her phone on the opposite end of the couch, physically present, but emotionally somewhere far beyond the walls of our house. And I asked if she wanted to watch a show together, not because I desperately needed television, but because I missed the quiet ritual of choosing something together, of sharing a blanket, of laughing at the same scene. She looked up at me with a calmness that felt calculated, almost practiced, and she said she was not my toy and not responsible for keeping me entertained, and there was no anger in her voice, no raised volume, just a flat certainty that made it worse, like she had rehearsed that line in her head long before I gave her the opportunity to use it. The words hit me harder than any shouted insult could have, because they reframed my simple request as a childish demand, as if wanting to spend time with my wife was evidence of dependency or control. And in that moment I saw clearly that in her narrative I had already been recast as the obstacle, the embodiment of everything she was trying to outgrow. I sat there feeling both embarrassed and oddly detached, as if I were watching a scene from someone else's marriage, and I realized that I was no longer her partner in a shared life, but an inconvenience she tolerated while she curated a new version of herself, one where I existed only as a contrast to her evolution. Over the previous year, Megan had enrolled in a branding certification program in Denver that required weekend flights, hotel stays, and a steady stream of tuition payments that quietly drained her joint savings. And she spoke about it, as if it were a pilgrimage toward her true self, while I stayed behind in Raleigh managing the routines that made those trips possible, taking care of the house, adjusting my own work schedule, and reassuring her that investing in herself was something I fully supported, even when I felt the financial strain tightening around us. She revamped her wardrobe with money from our joint account, replacing the comfortable jeans and soft sweaters she used to wear around the house with structured blazers, sleek boots, minimalist jewelry, and clothes that seemed designed for a version of her life that did not include me. And when I gently mentioned that maybe we should talk before making larger purchases, she stared at me like I had just tried to confiscate her identity. At the same time, she joined a boutique hot yoga studio in Cary, owned by a charismatic instructor named Ethan Cole, a man whose social media presence was a curated blend of mindfulness quotes, sculpted abs, and vague spiritual authority. And suddenly our evenings were rearranged around her class schedule, while she came home glowing and energized in a way I had not seen directed at me in months. She began using phrases like alignment and elevated frequency, and she would describe conversations at the studio about shedding limiting beliefs and confronting toxic masculine energy, and somehow that term started floating around our house in a way that always seemed to circle back to me. If I disagreed with her interpretation of a situation, it was framed as defensiveness. If I asked for more transparency about finances, it was labeled control. And if I expressed that I missed how close we used to be, she would nod thoughtfully and tell me that my attachment was rooted in insecurity. Meanwhile, I was the one paying the $2,300 monthly mortgage without fail, scheduling the HVAC maintenance, renewing our home insurance, comparing auto insurance quotes to shave off an extra $50 a month, handling property tax notices, replacing the aging water heater, rotating the tires on both cars, and tracking our retirement contributions to make sure we were not falling behind. I handled the invisible responsibilities that do not earn applause but prevent collapse, the quiet administrative work that keeps a life stable and predictable. Yet in her new language of empowerment, that stability became synonymous with stagnation, and my consistency was recast as an attempt to box her. And there were evenings when she would sit at the kitchen island explaining something she had learned in class about personal brands and narrative control, and she would talk about how women often shrink themselves in marriages to protect fragile male egos. And I would feel my chest tighten because the implication hovered unspoken but unmistakable. I tried to explain that wanting conversation, intimacy, and basic partnership was not an effort to dominate her, that asking how her day went or suggesting we plan a weekend together was not surveillance but affection, but she would respond with patient condescension as if I were a case study in resistance to growth. She would say I needed to unpack why I equated closeness with ownership, and the more I attempted to clarify that I did not want ownership but connection, the more she interpreted my persistence as proof of her thesis. What unsettled me most was the way she narrated our life to others, describing our home as heavy, with outdated expectations, while I sat a few feet away, feeling like a ghost in my own marriage, reduced to a symbol rather than a person. The mortgage statements, the spreadsheets, the late nights I stayed up reviewing our accounts, all of it dissolved in her retelling into evidence of patriarchal structure rather than partnership. And I began to realize that in the story she was constructing, I was no longer a husband trying to hold us together, but an embodiment of everything she was trying to transcend. After she told me she was not my toy and not responsible for keeping me entertained, something in me finally went still, not explosive, not dramatic, just still in a way that felt almost clinical. And instead of arguing or trying to dissect her words or pleading for clarity, I made a decision that required no announcement and no confrontation. I simply stopped. I stopped attempting to bridge the distance she insisted was necessary for her growth. I stopped offering reassurances that I was not trying to control her. And more importantly, I stopped performing the countless small, invisible acts I had carried out for years without acknowledgement, the quiet labor that had smoothed the edges of her daily life. I stopped prepping her car registration paperwork weeks before it was due, something I had always handled because she said bureaucratic tasks stressed her out. And when the renewal notice arrived in the mail, I left it on the kitchen counter untouched, resisting the reflex to fill it out for her and schedule the inspection. I stopped filling her gas tank every Sunday evening when I washed both cars, no longer making that extra stop at the station, so she would never have to think about it during her busy week. I stopped setting up the coffee maker at night, so it would brew automatically at 6 in the morning. And the first time she came downstairs to an empty, silent kitchen instead of the smell of fresh coffee, I said nothing and did nothing, simply sipped my own cup that I had prepared only for myself. I stopped covering her forgotten credit card payments when she overspent on clothes or course materials, and when she received a late fee notification and mentioned it in passing with irritation. I did not swoop in to fix it or transfer money between accounts to shield her from consequences. I stopped scheduling her dentist appointments, stopped replacing the batteries in her car key fob, stopped tracking when her prescriptions needed refilling, stopped acting as the quiet infrastructure beneath her increasingly curated independence. I did not threaten divorce. I did not draft ultimatums. I did not even raise my voice. I simply mirrored the autonomy she claimed to crave and removed myself from the background role I had been playing for more than a decade. At first, she seemed almost buoyant in the new silence, as if my withdrawal confirmed her narrative that she had been subtly managed all these years and was finally free to operate without interference. She moved through the house with exaggerated lightness, posting filtered yoga poses online with captions about shedding old energies and stepping into personal power, her phone propped up against books on the living room floor, while she arched into poses that emphasized control and flexibility. She would laugh on speakerphone with friends about how liberating it felt to reclaim space. And I listened from the other room while folding only my own laundry, cooking only enough dinner for myself when she said she would eat later, and allowing the house to reflect exactly the level of effort she chose to contribute. The quiet between us was not peaceful, but it was honest in a way our conversations had not been for months, stripped of performative compromise and loaded terminology, and I observed without commentary as small inconveniences began to accumulate around her like pebbles in a shoe. I did not gloat, and I did not point out what I was no longer doing. I simply allowed reality to function without my constant intervention, and for the first time in years, I felt the strange clarity that comes from stepping back and letting someone experience the independence they have been loudly demanding. The cracks appeared within weeks, not with some dramatic confrontation, but with a series of practical failures that exposed how much of her independence had been resting on work she never noticed. And the first real fracture came on a humid Thursday night when her SUV battery died in a grocery store parking lot after sunset. The kind of inconvenience that used to be a minor hiccup because I would have anticipated the aging battery months earlier and replaced it before it stranded her. My phone buzzed repeatedly while I was at the gym, her name flashing across the screen followed by a string of messages that shifted quickly from irritated to urgent, telling me to come fix this, telling me she was stuck, telling me this was ridiculous. And I looked at the screen without responding, not out of cruelty, but out of consistency with the boundary I had quietly set. I finished my workout, wiped down the equipment, drove home at my normal pace, and when I walked through the front door an hour later, she was already there, having paid for roadside assistance, her face tight with anger and something closer to fear beneath it. She demanded to know why I had ignored her, and I told her calmly that I had assumed she preferred handling her own situations, that she had spoken often about autonomy and self-reliance, and the silence that followed was thicker than any argument we had ever had. A week later, she locked herself out of the house after stepping outside to take a call, and instead of finding a spare key already hidden in the exact place I had maintained for years, she found nothing because I had stopped managing that small safety net, and she ended up paying $240 to a locksmith who arrived after dark and charged emergency rates. She was humiliated and furious, pacing the kitchen afterward while explaining how predatory service pricing was, and I listened without inserting myself as the fixer. Then the sink in the upstairs bathroom clogged slowly over several days, and instead of proactively scheduling the plumber the moment the drainage slowed as I'd always done, she ignored it until it backed up entirely and water pooled across the tile, which turned a minor maintenance call into an $1,100 repair involving pipe replacement and drywall patching. She even emailed our homeowners association about a garbage disposal issue that we legally owned and were responsible for, apparently assuming that external authority would absorb the inconvenience the way I always had, and when they responded by citing the section of the agreement that made it explicitly our problem, she seemed genuinely stunned. For the first time, she was experiencing the friction of daily life without my quiet labor smoothing it over. The hidden cost of independence, when no one is preemptively solving problems before they escalate, and I could see in the way she moved through the house that something in her narrative was beginning to strain. The filtered yoga posts continued. The captions about empowerment and personal sovereignty still appeared online, but beneath that polished exterior there was a new tension, a dawning awareness that autonomy carried logistical and financial weight she had never fully accounted for. I did not taunt her with this realization, and I did not claim vindication. I simply maintained the same steady withdrawal, allowing her to encounter the true price of the freedom she had insisted upon without my invisible infrastructure holding it together. During this period, she began oscillating in a way that would have been confusing if I had still been emotionally invested in deciphering her motives, shifting between cool indifference and sudden, almost theatrical sweetness, as if testing which version of herself would regain control of the atmosphere in our house. There were evenings when I would come home to find the dining table set with care I had not seen in years, elaborate dinners simmering on the stove, candles lit in soft amber pools of light, and the faint trace of the perfume I bought her for our 10th anniversary lingering in the air, a scent I had once associated with intimacy and celebration. She would move around the kitchen with deliberate grace, brushing past me close enough for her fingers to graze my arm, holding the contact just long enough to register, but not long enough to demand a response, and I could feel that she was measuring my reaction, evaluating whether the old reflexes were still intact. Her tone during those nights would soften. She would ask about my day with a warmth that felt almost convincing. She would laugh at minor jokes, lean forward across the table, rest her chin in her hand in a way that suggested curiosity and renewed interest, and for a fleeting moment it might have resembled the early years of our marriage, if not for the underlying tension that never fully dissolved. Yet even as she attempted these gestures of closeness, her phone habits told a different story, returning with quiet persistence like a tide she could not control. The screen was now permanently locked, angled away from me whenever she typed, and she began taking late-night calls in the bathroom with the faucet running as cover, emerging afterward with a neutral expression that did not match the faint flush in her cheeks. There were secretive smiles that appeared while she scrolled, small bursts of laughter she tried to suppress, and when I entered a room, she would subtly shift the device face down or tilt it away, movements so habitual they seemed unconscious. I did not confront her and I did not ask for explanations, not because I was unaware, but because I had reached a point where observation replaced interrogation, and I was watching rather than participating in whatever narrative she was constructing. The moment that stripped away any remaining ambiguity came one evening when I was in the living room reviewing work emails while she was in the kitchen. Her phone connected to her car earlier that day, and when she initiated a call, the Bluetooth automatically linked to the living room speaker without either of us realizing it. His voice filled the room before I could process what was happening, unmistakably male, confident and low, and I recognized it from the handful of times she had played clips from studio events online. Ethan Cole, the yoga studio owner she had described to me as a mentor and guide. He told her she deserved better, that she should not stay in a cage built by someone who did not understand her expansion. And there was a pause followed by her laughter, light and conspiratorial, nothing like the guarded tone she used with me. She said she was playing it smart until I fully detached, her words delivered with calculated patience, as if she were outlining a strategy rather than confessing an emotion. And in that instant, the elaborate dinners, the perfume, the softened tone all rearranged themselves into something transactional. I sat there listening to the rest of the conversation through the speaker until she noticed and abruptly disconnected. And when she walked into the living room and saw my expression, she understood that the performance had collided with reality. And for the first time since her reinvention began, there was no curated language to soften what had just been revealed. Instead of confronting her or exploding in some cathartic accusation that would only accelerate whatever narrative she was building, I did something far quieter and far more decisive. I began documenting everything with a calm detachment that surprised even me, screenshotting timelines, noting dates, preserving call logs. And then I opened the shared cloud backups she had long ago linked to our devices and forgotten were still synchronized to my laptop. I did not hack anything, and I did not guess passwords. I simply accessed what had always been shared, scrolling through months of archived messages that painted a progression too deliberate to dismiss as emotional confusion. What began as seemingly harmless exchanges about mindfulness and growth had slowly deepened into personal disclosures about our marriage, about me specifically, and I watched the pattern unfold with a clarity that was almost clinical. At first, Ethan positioned himself as a sounding board, validating her frustrations in language that echoed the vocabulary she had started using at home, telling her she was evolving beyond outdated dynamics, affirming that her discomfort was a sign of expansion rather than instability. Every minor disagreement she described to him was reframed as evidence of structural oppression within her marriage, and every attempt I had made to communicate was interpreted through his responses as subtle manipulation or fragile masculinity. He praised her courage for questioning our routines, applauded her when she described withdrawing from me emotionally, and encouraged her to prioritize alignment over obligation, each message nudging her further away while presenting himself as the enlightened alternative. Over the past month, the tone had shifted unmistakably from emotional intimacy to explicit messages that left no ambiguity about the nature of their connection, and reading them did not provoke the chaotic jealousy I might have expected, but rather a cold recognition that this had been cultivated step by step. He positioned himself as her rescuer from a cage he helped her define, reinforcing the idea that she deserved liberation while subtly undermining any residual loyalty she had toward me. She confided in him about our finances, about the house, about my routines, and he responded with strategic patience, advising her not to rush decisions, suggesting she prepare carefully so she would not destabilize her lifestyle. The most jarring realization was not the physical betrayal implied in those later messages, but the strategic layering that preceded it, the way he guided her interpretations until leaving seemed like an inevitable act of self-preservation rather than a choice. She wrote about waiting until I fully detached, about ensuring she would not appear impulsive, about securing her next step before dismantling the current one. And in that moment, any lingering doubt evaporated. She was not confused, not caught in some emotional fog, but methodically preparing an exit while keeping me financially steady and emotionally accessible enough to fund the transition. As I sat there reviewing the timeline, cross-referencing dates with the arguments we had at home and the sudden sweetness that followed, I felt something inside me shift in a way that was permanent and irreversible. The narrative of a struggling marriage dissolved into the clearer picture of a managed departure, and the pain that surfaced was less about betrayal and more about the precision of it. I understood then that the distance she accused me of creating was never about my shortcomings, but about space she needed to construct an alternative life while ensuring the infrastructure of the current one remained intact. I did not confront her with screenshots or rage or even accusation, because by that point I understood that truth did not need to be debated when it had already been documented, and instead I scheduled a consultation with a local attorney in Durham who specialized in family law and approached the meeting the same way I approach financial planning, with numbers, timelines, and clarity rather than emotion. I laid everything out in measured terms: the length of our marriage, the current balance on the mortgage, the $86,000 in equity we had built in our home, the retirement accounts, the vehicles, the shared savings, and I told him I wanted the agreement structured fairly, without punitive demands, without alimony claims, and with a clean equal division of assets that would not leave either of us financially crippled. He drafted the separation agreement precisely, legally sound, and emotionally neutral, a document that acknowledged the end of a partnership without theatrics. I waited until she proposed a weekend trip to Asheville to reconnect, a suggestion delivered with softness in her voice and a deliberate vulnerability that might once have disarmed me. And I agreed without hesitation, helping her pack with the same steady demeanor I had adopted over the previous months. I folded her sweaters, zipped her bag, placed her toiletries neatly in the side compartment, and 2 hours before we were supposed to leave, I handed her a plain envelope across the kitchen island. I did not explain it in dramatic terms, and I did not accuse her of anything. I simply told her I had taken care of what needed to be taken care of, and that she should read it carefully. Her face shifted as she opened it. First confusion, then comprehension, then a tightening around her eyes that suggested she had not anticipated losing control of the timeline. I told her I would be staying with my brother in Wilmington for a few days to give her space to review everything, and that the agreement was equitable, that it required no alimony and divided the equity in the home evenly, and that she could have her attorney look over it if she wished. There was no yelling, no dramatic collapse, just a long silence heavy with the realization that the strategy she had been cultivating was no longer hers alone to execute. I left that afternoon, drove east with the windows down despite the heat, and stayed with my brother long enough to let the shock settle into something stable. When I returned, the house felt unfamiliar in its stillness, and on the kitchen island were the signed papers, her signature firm and unmistakable, and on top of the stack rested her wedding ring, placed carefully, as if part of a display rather than a farewell. Megan was gone, her closet partially emptied, the absence more definitive than any argument we had ever had. Later, through mutual friends who still drifted between social circles in Raleigh and Cary, I learned that Ethan had already rekindled things with an ex-girlfriend and had described my wife as too intense, once she was no longer a secret, that the mystique of stolen intimacy had dissolved under the weight of reality. The irony was almost clinical in its symmetry, the enlightened rescuer retreating when the dynamic shifted from clandestine affirmation to tangible expectation, and in that information there was no triumph for me, only confirmation that what she had risked everything to pursue had never been built to sustain her beyond the shadows. Months later, I ran into Megan in the wine aisle at a Harris Teeter on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind of accidental collision that feels scripted by irony rather than coincidence. And for a moment, I almost walked past her without recognizing the version of her standing there under fluorescent lights. She was thinner than I remembered, not in the deliberate way she used to describe as sculpted or aligned, but in a way that suggested something unsettled beneath the surface. Her posture slightly curved inward, as if bracing against something unseen. In her hand, she held the same Cabernet she once declared symbolized freedom during one of her monologues about shedding outdated roles. The bottle tilted loosely between her fingers, as though it no longer carried the same triumphant weight. She saw me at the same time I saw her, and the practiced composure she used to carry dissolved into a brief flicker of nervousness that she could not mask quickly enough. We exchanged a restrained greeting, the polite cadence of two people who once shared a bed now reduced to the choreography of strangers with shared history. And when she spoke my name, it sounded smaller than it used to, stripped of the authority she once wielded so easily. She told me she had not expected to see me there, that she had been thinking about reaching out, and her words tumbled forward with an urgency that felt less strategic and more uncertain than anything I had witnessed during the final months of our marriage. She admitted she never believed I would actually leave, that she thought I would protest or negotiate or cling in a way that would validate the narrative she had built about my dependence on her presence. And there was something almost fragile in the way she said it, as though she was still trying to reconcile the fact that I had not played the role she assigned me. She said she made a mistake, that she misread everything, that she thought she was choosing growth but had instead dismantled something solid for something illusory. And while she spoke, I noticed how tightly she was gripping the bottle, her knuckles pale against the dark glass. I listened without interrupting and without offering comfort, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. Because in the months since I handed her that envelope, I had come to understand something that no amount of argument would have taught me. Loving someone does not require tolerating betrayal disguised as empowerment. And stepping back had shown me that what she framed as self-discovery was in many ways a calculated negotiation of leverage and timing. When she said she made a mistake, I did not feel vindicated or victorious, and I did not feel the surge of triumph that some might expect in that moment. I felt something steadier and far less dramatic. I felt the certainty that comes from recognizing patterns without needing to punish them. The quiet awareness that the woman standing in front of me was not the victim of confusion, but the architect of choices that unraveled when they were forced into daylight. The person who once looked at me and said she was not my toy had in fact been playing a careful game, calibrating distance and affection, weighing financial stability against emotional experimentation, and the game ended not because I outmaneuvered her, but because I stopped participating entirely. Standing there between shelves of discounted wine and promotional signs, I understood that whatever regret she carried now belonged to her alone, and that the clarity I gained by stepping back was not something I was willing to surrender for the comfort of nostalgia or the illusion of repair.